Hello, my name is Marielle Justine Sumilong. I'm a faculty member at the University of the Philippines, Department of Speech Communication and Theater Arts. My research interests include cultural and religious rhetoric, performance studies, performance of everyday life, and instructional communication. The research I'm going to be presenting to you today is titled Crises, Catholicism, and COVID-19, a rhetorical discourse analysis of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines pandemic responses. To give you a brief background and rationale of the study, churches and its history have long been intertwined with pandemics, specifically the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church have been seen providing shelter and sustenance to those in need during plagues, manifesting sympathy and humanity to those afflicted by pestilences, famines, and related crises. Conversely, pandemics have played a very important role in the Christianization of peoples and empires. That is because plagues intensify the natural course of life. They intensify people's mortality and frailty. They also intensify opportunities to display countercultural and counterconditional love, which Christian churches and Catholic churches are mandated to enact, are mandated to manifest towards the community. In the ancient Roman times, when plagues struck, it was often Christians who demonstrated the most humanitarian care toward the sick and dying that even pagans and oppressive emperors could not help but take notice. This held true even with the Great Plague, the London Plague, and even the most recent Spanish flu. Unfortunately, we are still in the middle of a global health emergency as of writing. Following the suspension of most economic, recreational, and educational and religious activities due to the COVID-19 pandemic, religious leaders from all around the world and their respective churches have either canceled their services indefinitely, their face to face services indefinitely, or have adopted virtual alternatives to continue their proceedings or processions. Here in the Philippines, most churches have gone online, have adopted virtual masses. There was a point in time last year when quarantine restrictions were a bit laxed and parishioners were able to attend masses physically but at a 50% capacity with a strict observation of distancing, as here in the picture, as can be seen in the picture. The Catholic Bishop Conference of the Philippines is the official Episcopal Conference of the Catholic Church in the Philippines, whose primary mandate is promoting the greater good, which the Church offers to humankind, especially through forms and programs of the apostolate, which are fittingly adapted to the circumstances of the time and place. As provided in their Constitution, the purposes of this Episcopal Conference is to, number one, promote solidarity in the Philippine Church. Number two, to engage the Philippine Church actively in the thrusts of the Universal Church. Number three is to assume the responsibilities as evangelizer in relation to all the people and in particular to civil authority. And fourth, to foster relations with other Episcopal conferences. Because of this rather active mandate to not just promote the church and to gain more engagement, CBCP actually enacts a more active role with regards to citizenship. Philippine Catholic Church leadership, represented by the CBCP, has long been perceived as a significant actor in promoting democracy through engaged citizenship. Engaged citizenship is not simply a matter of asserting legal claims, but CPCP has its own unique history of enacting secular political activism. CBCP has been known to manifest a command of engagement over its parishioners and, in many instances, has demonstrated its capacity to influence people's political judgments and oppose authoritarian regimes. The organization was particularly involved in the People Power Revolution of 1986. CBCP was one of the first organizations to provide and to issue a statement condemning the elections that put former president and dictator Ferdinand Marcos as fraudulent. CBCP was very vocal and was able to heighten the resistance against the dictatorial regime. Until current times, they are still very much involved and very vocal on expressing criticisms and opposing views of government administrations, as can be seen in the picture over here. With all these background in mind, because of the Catholic Church's strong historical ties with pandemics and with CBCP's mandates, as well as social functions and sphere of influence, the research was prompted to explore three questions. These three questions. First is, what role does the Church perform in the COVID-19 pandemic? Second is the role of clergy in navigating the current crises still crucial in sustaining the community? And finally, how does the Church, through the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, enact its role in response to the current global health emergency? To help guide the study, the researcher has adapted Kenneth Burke's dramatic pentad as a main theoretical framework. Kenneth Burke is a renowned rhetorical theorist. He believed that the language of drama provided a means of assessing rhetorical settings in order to come to some understanding of why people choose to do the actions that they do, why people are motivated to do certain actions that are rhetorical. Kenneth Burke's dramatic pentad is a method of analysis and a corresponding critique of terminology designed to show the most direct route to the study of human relations and human motivations via a methodical inquiry into cycles or clusters of terms and in their functions. One or all of the elements involved in a rhetorical setting enables the critic or the researcher to understand what is being done or what is happening in the rhetorical act. Kenneth Burke's dramatic pentad has 5 elements: the act, what is being done in the rhetoric, the agent or the actor who is doing the action, the scene or the context, when and where is it taking place, the purpose, why is it being done, and the agency, by what means or with what instruments is it being done. Dramatic pentad provides a complete statement or a complete analysis about motives that offer some kind of answer to these 5 questions. The main unit of analysis that was used in the study is, of course, the official statements of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines. The official statements are still publicly available in cbcpnews.net. These official statements vary in terms of function. They are pastoral statements, circulars, and guidelines published here in the website, their official news service or depository. The official statements were then funneled down or filtered down to only reflect the following topics: COVID-19, pandemic, quarantine, crisis response, as well as vaccination. And only those statements that were released from March 2020 to January 2021 were included in the study. And these were 11 official statements. These are actually the official statements. You can view the link to these official statements in the digital copy of my presentation available in my CG Scholar profile. Okay, so to discuss the methodology on how this study was done, I would like to first emphasize that the main analysis or the main method that was used is complementary to the theoretical framework. This study implemented Kenneth Burke's cluster agon analysis. So in order to implement the method, the The first step of the study was, of course, to gather the official statements to be used as research artifacts. Again, these official statements must cover the topic criteria, and they should be able to manifest at least 5 to 6 important or key terms, and they should be long and complex enough for analysis. They should be long and complex enough to be able to not just manifest key terms, but for the researcher to establish connection between those key terms. After selecting the research artifacts, cluster agon analysis, or Kenneth Burke's cluster agon analysis, was then implemented. Kenneth Burke's cluster agon analysis is a method developed by Kenneth Burke to help the rhetorical critic identify the motive of the rhetor. In this method, the meaning that key symbols have for the rhetor or the agent are discovered by charting what symbols cluster around those key symbols in the rhetoric. Through charting the frequent key terms and the relationship of clusters, a critic is then able to discover or reinforce or draft the interrelationships of the key terms, resulting in insights that highlight the motivations and the actions of the rhetor. To break it down into three major steps, the first step in cluster analysis is, of course, the selection of the key terms in all the articles, in all the research artifacts. The key terms are the most important terms used in the rhetorical act or artifact, around 5 to 6. The significance of the key terms is based on the frequency or the intensity that it was used in the articles. Often, these terms are selected as key terms, and they are further sorted into God terms and good terms. God terms are the ultimate terms that represent the ideal for the rhetor, the primary value, the main motivation of the rhetor or the agent's view of what is best or perfect. Those are selected as the God terms. The devil terms, on the other hand, are the counterparts of the God terms and represent the ultimate negative or evil for the rhetor. Now, the God term is usually closely surrounded by good terms. The good terms are not given the ultimate power of the God term, but they represent a smaller number of terms where they're also very valued. They also manifest frequently in the artifact, and they usually cluster around the God terms, and they are usually, have a relationship with each other. Critics gather data for cluster and agon analysis by listing these terms, the context, and the relationships the speaker or the rhetor uses with each key terms. Agons, on the other hand, agons are the opposite of terms. A cluster analysis is not complete if it's just God terms and devil terms. It lacks a sense of conflict and drama, which is the main device that Kenneth Burke uses in his study of human motivation in rhetoric. Agon analysis, or the analysis of agons, reveal that those terms which are in opposition to each other reveal such conflicts or such oppositions. They provide symbolic conflict when opposing key terms are located. The critic can find symbols of conflict that occurs within the speaker or the rhetor's rhetoric and statements. So after the critic identify the key terms, the God term, the devil terms, the good terms, and the agons, the researcher charts the relationships, the interrelationships of the terms, and then finally, through research, through reference to literature, the researcher is able to uncover the explanation and the themes behind these key terms. Step 3 is going back to the research questions in an attempt to answer them with the themes found, the relationships between the key terms found in the previous step. And then the fourth step would be writing the analysis and the findings. where the researcher recapitulated the research questions, the responses or the results of the study based on the research questions. The researcher described the rhetorical setting or the context. They defined key terms and explained the analysis. So, to discuss the analysis and findings of the study, here are the key terms and the clusters found in all of the 11 statements. Again, the 11 statements are the filtered research artifact for this paper. So, the God terms in all of those articles, in all of those official statements, were universal and communal. They were the most frequently used, and most of the official statements center around the idea, the value of universality and being communal. The good terms that surround these God terms are collective action, common good, faith communities, and public discernment, which are often very synonymous also to the God terms as well. They are able to highlight the emphasis for collective action. The agons, the conflict that these God terms encounter in these articles are these terms: isolation, separation, and distancing, which are also very much present in a lot of the articles or official statements. Another God term that was found is cooperation. Cooperation, surrounded by good terms, by clusters, including concrete action, participation, obedience, recommendation, and support, with the agon term being dispensation. There's only one devil term found because it was the most frequently used in all of the articles, and that is fear. Fear. So, fear is the agent, CBCP's most negative or most negative term in all of its official statements. So fear is being clustered by the other terms death, restlessness, darkness, disease, and lost life. The agon, the opposite, being hope and love. So, what do these terms tell us? What are the implications? What does the CBCP what does the CBCP or how does the CBCP perceive its role? What are the role functions that they perceive? What are the imperatives? What are the recommendations that they give emphasis to in their statements? First is invocation of Oratio Imperata. Oratio Imperata is an obligatory prayer for special situations such as natural calamities, storms, snow, and drought, and more rare circumstances such as war, plague, and the disruption of public peace in society. Almost all or all of these statements double as collective appeals for prayer. Three of them are actually explicit on being an oratio imperata. They are actually calls for prayers. Next is the call for collective action, which is one of the CBCP's most highlighted role. Call for collective action. CBCP emphasizes the value of community, togetherness, and collective action at the time of the pandemic in treating communal efforts to number one. So they encourage the readers, the community, the parishioners to help. So it together, let us help the state control the spread of the disease. So, with the spirit of collective action, we must preserve the health and wellness of the Filipino families, fellow Catholics, and vulnerable members in the community, like the rural settlers, the elderly, the immunocompromised, and the youth. And three is to maintain unity in faith, albeit virtually. In some of the statements, so 4 out of 11, the religious organization, CBCP, also calls for secular political activism, which is very consistent with its mandate, hinted by appeals for public discernment, proper treatment of the poor and marginalized, and political humility and honesty. What else? So, assertion of influence. This theme that has been found in the key terms gives the implication that CBCP is aware. They are aware of its scope and influence in the community, and they are, in fact, using this medium, the electronic medium, the website, the electronic news website, to elicit cooperation from the community to follow state protocols on quarantine and public health, and they assert influence towards the government as well, towards the government and state, and actually giving recommendations on how to manage several state affairs. Official statements reflect CBCP's capacity to engage in illicit cooperation, not just from its parishioners, but from the government as well. Why? 6 out of the 11 statements address state leaders directly. They are addressing the statements are addressed to the leaders, the state leaders directly, providing recommendations and moral guidance on many state affairs, such as the management of the social amelioration funds, the social assistance funds, quarantine protocols, and even inoculation or vaccinations. All statements of all 11 statements contain reminders for parishioners and lay ministers to cooperate and follow quarantine measures prescribed by the government and to exercise their faith while practicing social distancing. So these are the two common reminders evident and present in all of these statements. Yes, in all of the 11 statements, they constantly remind the readers of their statements to cooperate with the government and to still continue exercising their faith while practicing social distancing. Next theme that has been found in these key terms is the promotion of unity in spite of. Agon terms such as isolation, separation, and distancing highlight the contradiction between what the CBCP wants. A while ago, in the previous slide, I discussed that it's very evident that what they're advocating for is collective action. However, they also are able to recognize that there is a contradiction between the call for togetherness, and CBCP actually addresses this contradiction. They're able to address that parishioners have to be collective, have to enact community action despite having to deal with a crisis in isolation. So this is a very constant theme, very evident theme in the statement. The promotion of unity in spite of being stuck, being in isolation from each other. Next is the acknowledgement of fear. CBCP acknowledges the devil term fear as an adversary, an exigence in this crisis. This is also evident along with the clustering terms death, restlessness, darkness, disease, and lost lives. The statements recognize the universal feelings of fear and anxiety in these uncertain times as feelings also present in church among its members. So CBCP is able to communicate that this organization, they too feel fear. The statements are also reflexive of the church's promotion of hope, Christ-like love, sacrifice, service, and discipleship despite the fears, the uncertainties, and grief. They are almost always able to combat or to try to address this common universal feeling of fear that they do acknowledge in the statements. Finally, the CBCP statements is very the extension of aid and action are very prevalent in the CBCP statements. CBCP asserted in one statement its provision of temporary shelters for medical personnel, doctors, nurses, medical staff through the conversion of available pastoral centers and retreat houses. So This is very consistent with CBCP's functions and mandates. CBCP was able to verbalize its own efforts, how the organization itself is able to extend aid and action to those who are vulnerable, to those who are in need. One statement recommended the creation of programs in providing care and catechism and extending economic aid to the poor communities. Most of the action CBCP extended comprised of providing recommendations for ethical scientific research, just provision for the poor, and upholding of honesty and morality. So aside from that one statement um, that verbalized the mandate of CBCP to convert their structures as temporary shelters, in all throughout the official statements, they are still able to extend aid and action through these recommendations. They're always recommending and commanding government, the government or government leaders to always conduct ethical research, to provide justly for the poor, and to always uphold honesty and morality for the benefit and for the sake of the community. What is the theoretical application of all of this? We now go back to the theoretical framework. Now we have answers to the dramatic pentad, to the questions that Kenneth Burke is asking to make us understand the rhetorical situation better. Let's go to the agent first. Who is doing the action? Now, of course, we know that the rhetor or the agent or the actor is, of course, CBCP. The scene, what is the context? When and where is this taking place? Now, the rhetoric of CBCP through its official statements is in the middle of this communication context. It is in the middle. So the statements are released in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, while the Philippines' densely populated regions are still on strict quarantine. So this is the milieu. This is the scenario. This is the context of the rhetorical setting. Act. What was being done or what is being done? CBCP releases statements online through cbcpnews.net, providing provisions and guidance addressing concerns related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Official statements are publicly available and are shareable across most social media platforms. So that was the rhetorical act. CBCP as the rhetor or the agent uses the the electronic means to publicly release statements providing these provisions and guidance and aids, extensions of aids. These statements are for the public to read, to follow, to share, and to abide to. Agency, by what means? These public official statements were released via cbcpnews.net. And again, they are publicly available, they are shareable, they have links that people can use to share in their respective social media profiles. The most important question here is why? What is the purpose of this rhetorical act? What is the purpose of CBCP releasing statements related to the COVID-19 pandemic? The researcher was able to find these main purposes. First is the CBCP released official statements to invoke prayer, an important prayer, oratio imperata. They want to invoke prayer to all its parishioners, to the community, because we are, in fact, in a time of a global health emergency. This is a very, very special time. They were able to release official statements related to the pandemic to issue a call for collective action, to call for unity, because we are already, or the parishioners are already isolated and separated from each other. CBCP is able to recognize that now more than ever, we need collective action as a community to fight against this global health emergency. CBCP official statements to assert their influence not just over the community, but over the state as well. They were trying to promote unity despite of the circumstances. They were able to release these statements acknowledging the universal fear and uncertainty. And finally, they are able to verbalize that they themselves, as an organization, extends aid to those in need. Let's go back to our research questions. What do these themes, what does the theoretical application tell us? How do these themes, these key terms, these insights answer our research questions? The first research question that we have is, what role does the church perform? Does the church, the Catholic Church, represented by the CBCP, perform in the COVID-19 pandemic? So first, through these statements, CBCP was able to assert these primary roles, these four primary roles that they see themselves acting upon. First is they serve as the primary moral guidance of the state and the community. Second, CBCP and the Catholic Church serves as the catalyst for community action. They are able to promote solidarity, selflessness, and hope amidst the time of fear, distancing, and isolation. CBCP and the Catholic Church also acts as refuge and support for medical frontliners and marginalized communities. And finally, the final role function that CBCP perceives that it's doing and it's manifesting through its public statements is that CBCP models compliance. They model compliance to the state set quarantine protocols and organizational adaptation of its restrictions, because they are also able to issue recommendations of the adaptation to virtual masses and social distancing in its churches, in its physical churches. So the themes and the key terms enable the researcher to find these four main role functions of the CBCP in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. So, what what do these roles tell us? Now, one of the related literature in the study is by Tippy, published in 2006. Tippy asserted the following functions of the church in the community. Tippy said that the church has three major functions in the community. First is to provide education in religion and morality. Second is the church is involved in functions related in all that concerns the welfare of its inhabitants. So the church is most often seen involved in education, industrial prosperity, public health, public recreation, beauty of the geography, public housing, conditions and hours of labor, standards of living, protection of the youth, promoting honest, efficient, and democratized government. And the church also functions as the common social movement of the community, acting with existing religious, civic, commercial, and charitable agencies. So Tippy was able to highlight these three functions, and the role functions that the researcher was able to find in the official statements are very much consistent. They are very much reflective of the literature, of the functions of the church in the community that Tippy was able to highlight. The church, CBCP, was able to provide guidance in education, in religion and morality. They are able to involve themselves in civic concerns in the welfare of its inhabitants by providing, refuge, support for the medical frontliners. They're able to model compliance to the state affairs, state protocols, and common social movement of the community. So they are able to catalyze community action. So they are very much complementary. So the role functions is consistent with previous literature. Second question, the second research question is the role of the clergy in navigating the current crises still crucial in sustaining the community? The short answer is yes. To expound why their role functions are in fact still significant, we refer back to one of our related literature by South et al. Done just last year. South et al. Elaborated and asserted the importance of collective response um, in strengthening the overall community resilience. So South et al. Elaborated and emphasized that collective response is one of the key ways that a community can strengthen its overall community resilience at the time of the pandemic. Collective response has actually been one of the God terms, the value highlighted across all of the statements. By upholding the value of collectiveness, of collective response, CBCP, the church, is already doing its part. According to South et al., it is through the action of the community members via the majority of the people adhering to social distancing, respiratory, and hand hygiene recommendation that the spread of disease is attenuated. Um, a good collective response or an organization that promotes collective response takes advantage of the opportunity to create a new way of working and to realize the ambition of a more community centered system building upon community driven initiatives. So that is a tick mark for CBCP. An organization that promotes collective response implements a whole systems approach in strengthening community resilience that involve good public health intelligence, assessed community vulnerabilities and capabilities across key economic and social indicators in combination with gathering insights from marginalized groups, which is also a value that the church, CBCP, puts importance to. And organizations with a good collective response has a shared understanding of local assets and vulnerabilities that will help in planning actions in the recovery period. Now, these characteristics of a good collective response are very consistent with the role functions that we were able to mention earlier, the key terms found, and the overall messages or themes of the official CBC statements. And finally, we have the research question number 3. How then does the church, through the Catholic Bishop Conference of the Philippines, enact its role in response to the current global public health emergency? So despite the great, the universal restriction of isolation and distancing, by utilizing electronic media, by using the media and the accessibility of social networking, the Filipino Catholic Church, represented by CBCP, retains its faithful presence in the commons as it acknowledges and attempts to address the struggles and sufferings of community in the current crisis. The Church succeeds in gospel and continues the faith and service, especially to the poor and marginalized. CBCP uses its influence to enjoin parishioners in solidarity while ensuring the quest for truth, justice, and peace. And finally, by using electronic media, by making their official statements shareable and available, shareable through social networking, CBCP is able to prescribe compliance with state given quarantine and public health protocols. So finally, these are how I think the researcher thinks the study can be further enriched by exploring or adding these factors. So these are my recommendations for further studies or for replications of the studies. The unit of analysis, further researches can make use of more statements, more recent statements of the CBCP. Statements or official statements of other Philippine religions can also be analyzed. Independent statements of Philippine Catholic religious orders like the Jesuits, Dominicans, and Benedictines can also be used for comparison. Theoretical framework. So instead of using the more traditional framework, which is Kenneth Burke's dramatic pentad, because the unit of analysis is electronic, is digital, it's available online. A good take or an alternative framework that can be used would be digital rhetoric perspectives. These other methods can also be used to analyze the key terms: Neo-Aristotelian criticism, fantasy theme criticism, and ideological criticism. And for additional variables, perhaps further researchers can study the other end of the spectrum, the parishioners' engagement or responses. And with that, I end my presentation. Should you have any concerns about my study, you are free to email me in my contact info as flashed in the screen. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening to my study.